Hello everyone, my name is DM Rawlings, the 10-Minute DM. I'm an experienced Forge in the Dark GM and designer, and I'm here to offer some advice 10 minutes at a time. Today we're going to talk about common pitfalls when making action rolls, using a top 10 list, which means yes indeed, I am selling out to the algorithm already. But before we begin, please catch up on making action rolls in whatever Forge in the Dark game you're talking about. Candela Obscura, Fort Blades in the Dark, whatever. We're not going to be doing rules summaries here. We're going to focus on the meat. So starting at number 10, you're treating a 1 as a worse amount than a 3. Remember, in the rules, 1 to 3 is a failure, and that means that 1 is not worse by definition than a 3. And even I make this mistake sometimes. Someone rolls 3 dice and they come up all 1s and you're like, oh, that's terrible. But, rules as written, the way that we should be looking at this, it's still a failure. All right. Number 9, you're not treating a 4 to 5 as a success. 4 to 5 is a success, but there's a consequence. You do get what you want, but something else happens. It's not a partial success unless you were to apply a reduced effect complication, which we'll talk about complications later. Right? A 6 is a full success, but that doesn't mean that it's a bigger success than a 4 to 5. Number 8, you're letting the effect be too great or too little. In Blades in the Dark, we have this thing called effect, which measures how successful an action roll is going to be. So as way of example, say from D&D, if you were using radiant damage against a shadow, you would have great effect because they are vulnerable to that. But if you were using fire damage instead, it would be limited because they are resistant to it. In Candela Obscura, effect isn't explicit. So that means we have a couple of ways that we can approach this. We can either say, no matter what happens, all results have around the same amount of good stuff that happens when you succeed. Or if you want to get a little more advanced, go ahead and apply effect regardless by following the fiction. If someone is using the right tools for the job, maybe they're going to succeed better than someone who has poor tools or something like that. I'll definitely do an effect video later because I think that it's a good conversation to have. Number 7, you're not giving the stakes to your players. And again, stakes in Candela Obscura, either low, normal, or high. That is how much danger they're going to be in when making that roll. And remember that equipment or the way that people approach problems may modify those stakes. And if you do tell someone the stakes and they go, ooh, I'm not ready for a high stakes move right now, I don't want to risk my character's body like that, then let them back out and pick a new approach if they think that it's too dangerous. Number 6, you're not getting enough context from your players. So I'm sure in D&D and any game that you've ever played, someone says, I want to make a perception check, or I want to roll survey, what do I see? In cases like this, you don't have enough information to properly adjudicate the results. So stop and ask some questions. Ask them, how are you searching? What are you using to look around? Where specifically are you looking? What kind of thing are you looking for? And what does your character look like while they do this? It can be really, really hard to pick consequences when someone is giving very ambiguous ideas about what's going on. So ask your players to put you in the mind's eye so that you can see things from their perspective, and it just really helps the fiction. Number 5, you're not progressing the story with the result. So when you're taking an action in Candela Obscura, you're more concerned with framing what you're trying to accomplish rather than the specific deed. So in D&D, very often there are multiple steps that are each individual actions. You need to make an acrobatics check to get to this place to stab someone in the back. Well, in Candela Obscura, very often that's going to be handled in a single roll. So you might be able to get away with, a single roll to do that versus several in D&D. And an example might be a stealth check. So very often people say, okay, I'm going to hide or I want to sneak. And for us, that's not really good enough. What we want is we want to know what the player is trying to accomplish. And if we know what the player is trying to accomplish, then we can properly set them up in the right spot to have them take a proper action in Candela Obscura. Number 4, you are repeating your rolls. If a character fails, it shouldn't be easy for them to try the same roll again. As a DM, you can just say, no, you're not allowed to try that again, but a better approach is to try to make it so that the consequences that occur after a roll make trying impossible. So, for example, maybe someone is trying to pick a lock. So here they are, they're trying to pick this lock, and they get a outright failure. So at this point we can say, no, you didn't pick the lock, but that's not moving the fiction forward. Instead, what we want to do is we want to add something to the scene that makes picking that lock a second time more challenging. Maybe not impossible. You might say something like your tools break inside of it. You might say, as you are picking the lock, you hear noises in the distance, someone is getting close. You want to pick something that makes them not immediately able to pick up the dice and make that same roll again, or have somebody else make that roll. You shouldn't be like perception, like going around a room and seeing who's able to see things. There's other games for that. Number 3, you're rolling when failure isn't interesting, when there are no stakes to the roll. Earlier I said there were 3 levels of stakes, low, normal, high. Well, that was a lie. There's actually a 4th level called none. And if the stakes are none, failure isn't really interesting. Just let them have that, right? It's easy enough to just continue the story, because honestly, coming up with consequences in those circumstances is incredibly challenging, and it also is kind of nonsensical. Number 2, you're rolling too often. In Forged in the Dark games, every action, every time that you try to do something, there is a risk that there is going to be some kind of consequence. Someone might get hurt. You might get something new added to the scene. So you just don't want to pile on rolling for every small obstacle that the players are going to hit. Instead, what you want to do is you want to batch them up into problems and then solutions to those problems, or being in a place and trying to find information and then determining what they determine, rather than, oh, I search the desk, oh, I search, in the stock area. Like, it's not really interesting to have people rolling all the time, especially when the consequences of a poor roll could make the story just very, very difficult. Number 1, you're blocking the fiction's progress on a failure. So this is not really a Forged in the Dark thing, this is just general RPGs. If you lock progress behind a single roll in your game, you're asking for trouble when someone bricks that roll. So a couple of ways you could approach this. Use the 3-clue rule to make sure that there's always options. If they fail one roll, there's still 2 more opportunities. Or alternatively to that, you can just let the character who's most likely, according to the fiction, just find information that's necessary. Stumble on the right place, move the right book on the bookcase. There's any number of things like that. So that should be all, but I actually do have a bonus one for you. And that is Step 0. You're letting your players be weasels. So weaseling is from Blades in the Dark, and it's defined as follows. It's stretching the fiction in order to take advantage of a strong action score or a special ability. But for Candela Obscura, I think we should also throw in trying to farm actions with gilded dice to replenish drive. So in the case of the former, what we want to do is, if someone is coming in and saying, oh, I think that I have this convoluted plan to make my tinker, is tinker one of the actions? I don't recall. I want to use my strike in this particular situation. And you look at it and you go, I don't know how strike could possibly apply. By all means, ask them to try something else. Give them that Fry, not sure if gaze of suspicion, and say, try it a different way. And it is okay to just outright say, no, that isn't really valid. And for the latter, where people are trying to farm actions, make sure that consequences suit the stakes. So if they are failing with consequence, they are recovering that gilded die, but they're paying a price for it. And again, remember, if the stakes are none, they just don't get to roll in the first place, so they don't get a chance to replenish. So there you go. In closing, those are my top 11 action roll pitfalls to avoid. I've been DM Rawlings, the 10-Minute DM. And if you like what you see, please don't forget to hit subscribe. Thank you.